Is the state prepared to give its opening statement at this time? You may proceed.
Good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Sarah Catherine Dugan. Georgia Kappelman and I are representing the state of Florida in this case. And this is the defendant, Donna Adelson. We see her here at the defense table, and this is how she appeared back in 2014 when this crime occurred 11 years ago. And the reason that we're here today is because this defendant, Donna Adelson, was part of a conspiracy to hire a hitman to kill her former son-in-law, Dan Markel. This murder was set into motion because back in 2014, this defendant's family had a big problem. And the big problem was Dan Markel. And the solution to that problem was the defendant's son, Charlie Adelson. Charlie Adelson was the solution because he had a girlfriend with connections. Tragically, on July 18th of 2014, Dan Markel was shot in the head in broad daylight in the driveway of his home in the Benton Hills neighborhood here in Tallahassee. He pulled into his driveway and he opened his garage. Two hired hitmen who traveled all the way to Tallahassee from Miami for the sole purpose of taking his life. The killers pulled in right behind him. Moments later, Dan Markel's neighbor heard a gunshot, and he looked out the window and saw a light-colored Toyota Prius back quickly out of Dan Markel's driveway and speed away. The neighbor got, a very funny feeling, and he went over to Dan Markel's open garage to see if there was anything wrong, and he found a gruesome scene. Dan Markel's car window, his driver's side window, was shattered. His glasses and his phone were on the ground next to his car, and Dan Markel was behind the wheel. He was unresponsive and moaning and terribly injured. He was taken to the hospital where he survived for about 14 hours before he was pronounced dead. Dan Markel was only 41 years old. The scene there, the crime scene, left no trace of the killers. There was no fingerprints, no DNA, no bullet casing, nothing was stolen. And so police began to suspect that this may be a professional killing. Who in Dan Markel's life would hate him enough to hire a professional killer to kill him? This defendant. So, first let's talk about the path involving motive. We'll go down both paths this morning. Police investigated Dan Markel's personal life, and they learned that Dan Markel was entangled in a very nasty divorce with his ex-wife, who is the defendant's daughter, and his ex-wife is named Wendy Adelson. Wendy Adelson had asked the court to allow her to relocate to Miami, where she was from and where her parents lived, with her children. The victim, Dan Markel, as y'all can imagine, is adamantly opposed to this, to his children being relocated to Miami. The defendant hated Dan Markel and was the relentless driving force behind Wendy's relocation efforts to South Florida. She was extremely controlling. She had very strong opinions about all the decisions in Wendy Adelson's life, whether it be about her career, her relationships, or even purchasing a home. And while the defendant had always been controlling of her children's lives, the emails uncovered by law enforcement showed that this defendant was desperate to find a way for Wendy and Dan Markel's children, her grandchildren, to be able to relocate to Miami. During the divorce and custody battle, the defendant's email showed that she was heavily involved in Wendy's court case. The defendant would guilt trip Wendy Adelson about how much time she and her husband, Harvey Adelson, were having to spend away from their dental practice to visit Wendy and the grandkids in Tallahassee. And the defendant instructed Wendy Adelson that relocation to Miami was the most important priority in this divorce, and if it had to be her non-negotiable in the divorce. In June of 2013, the judge in the divorce case ended up ruling in Dan Markel's favor. And not only did the judge deny Wendy's relocation motion, but the judge dismissed it in a way that prevented Wendy Adelson from requesting the relocation again. So Wendy would not be permitted to move to Miami to be close to the defendant and her husband with the children, unless, of course, something happened to Dan Markel. After the judge denied the relocation motion, she let Wendy know that the Adelson family is a team and they are trying to win. Donna Adelson suggested in her emails several bribes, like plane tickets, paying for her grandson's education, and the defendant even suggested offering Dan Markel a $1 million bribe to allow the relocation, to let Wendy move to Miami with the boys. The defendant told Wendy to aggravate Dan Markel like he aggravates you. And the defendant set out a plan of action. The defendant knew that Dan Markel was devoutly Jewish. So she came up with the idea for Wendy to pose Dan Markel's sons for pictures in front of a Catholic church, and even announced on social media she was getting the children baptized just to make it appear to Dan Markel that she was changing their religion. But told Wendy Adelson that in order to pull off the stunt, she had to put on the acting performance of her life. The defendant said that it did not matter to her if Wendy had to dress her two little toddlers up in Nazi or SS uniforms, as long as she was able to get them to South Florida and show Dan Markel that he was not in control. And the defendant said that she would never, never, never give up and never stop fighting for Wendy and the boys to be relocated to Miami. This defendant's closest confidant was her son, Charlie Adelson. She and Charlie Adelson talk multiple times a day, every day. And he was the person with whom she would constantly vent and complain to about Wendy's situation here in Tallahassee, having to live in Tallahassee with her sons. The defendant portrayed Dan Markel to Charlie Adelson as a crazy person who was impossible to deal with and was causing an extreme amount of stress to Donna Adelson and her husband, Harvey Adelson. Although the divorce between Wendy and Dan Markel was final a year before the murder, throughout that year, litigation is still ongoing, to say the least. Each side is continuing to routinely file violations of the custody agreement, violations of the settlement agreement, and that continued right up until Dan Markel's death in 2014. Dan Markel alleged that the defendant, Donna Adelson, was disparaging him to his children. He was very worried about her trying to alienate him from his children. She was doing this by calling him stupid in front of the boys and telling the boys that Dan Markel was trying to take them away from her. And the murder of Dan Markel ensured that not having access to her grandchildren would never be a problem for this defendant. And what do you know? About 48 hours after Dan Markel was killed, Wendy Adelson and the little boys relocated to Miami, moved into the defendant's home with her, and the boys started school down the street. And just like that, their father was effectively erased from their lives, and the Adelsons' big problem had been solved. And this defendant, though, she managed much more than just the office for the Adelson family. She was the matriarch. and a domineering one at that. She ran the office, the home, and the lives of the Adelson family members. Wendy Adelson told police, and the police confirmed this, that she was at home having her TV fixed, at her home in Tallahassee, having her TV fixed at the time of Dan Markel's murder. And when police asked her, well, do you know anyone who would have a motive to kill Dan Markel? Wendy Adelson acknowledged that her family had a motive to want Dan Markel dead and said that her parents had more reason to dislike Dan Markel than anybody else. Wendy admitted to police that her brother, Charlie Adelson, had joked that he looked into hiring a hitman to kill Dan Markel as a divorce present, but decided to buy her a TV instead because it was cheaper. And what do you know? The same TV that Charlie Adelson bought his sister as a divorce gift would be Wendy Adelson's alibi the morning of the murder. When law enforcement retraced Dan Markel's steps on the morning of his murder, they uncovered some very chilling surveillance video of that light-colored Prius, fitting the description given by the neighbor, following Dan Markel into the Premier Gym parking lot and waiting for an hour while he was inside, and then following him home from Premier Gym back to Benton Hills. And these surveillance images, coupled with a massive amount of phone and SunPass records gathered in this case, help police track down the exact car used to commit this crime. Finding this Prius and finding evidence in these phone records was not an easy task, and it took much longer than your average investigation of a shooting, as you'll hear. But law enforcement eventually found that needle in the haystack. They found a number that communicated with the cell tower that services Premier Gym at the exact time when the Prius was there. And it was a number with a Miami area code, and that number belonged to a man named Sigfredo Garcia. Law enforcement examined Garcia's call logs, and they saw that he was in frequent contact with another number that was present at Premier Gym that day. And that number belonged to a man named Luis Rivera, who is a longtime friend of Garcia, and he's also from Miami. They both are. The phone data shows that these men turned their phones off just minutes before the murder took place, and their phones then stayed off for about an hour or so after the murder until they were well southbound to Miami. I think around the Gainesville area, the phones turned back on. And then, once they got back to Miami, a bank's ATM camera caught them in the light-colored Prius at a bank drive-thru and caught both of the men in the Prius. One of the shooter, Garcia's, most frequent contacts was a woman named Catherine Magbanois. She goes by Katie. The shooter and Magbanois have a long history of an on-again, off-again relationship, and they share 2 kids in common. This is Garcia and Magbanois. Law enforcement sees that Catherine Magbanois is also one of the most frequent contacts in the phone records of Charlie Adelson, the defendant's son. The same son that she had been nagging to death about his sister being stuck in Tallahassee. Law enforcement also learned that at the time of this murder, Catherine Magbanois was dating Charlie Adelson. So, Dan Markel was a problem the defendant needed to solve. The defendant's son, Charlie Adelson, was looking to hire a hitman to kill Dan Markel. Dan Markel is killed by a hitman. And who ended up being a hitman? Someone with a close relationship to Charlie Adelson's girlfriend, the father of her children. Law enforcement reviewed bank records, employment records, DHS&V records of all the suspects, and saw that in the months after the homicide, Garcia, Rivera, and Magbanois all acquired some big-ticket items. Rivera and Garcia both bought motorcycles and cars, Magbanua got a breast augmentation surgery and later received a black Lexus sedan whose previous owner was Harvey Adelson. Bank records also showed that Magbanua's account had a huge spike in cash deposits around the time of the murder. She deposited more money in her account in the 5 weeks after the murder than in the entire year before the murder. And this was during a time when there was no record of her being employed anywhere. And also, about 2 months after the murder, this defendant added Catherine Magbanua to the payroll at the Adelson family's dental practice, the one that she kept the accounts for, the defendant kept the accounts for. And the defendant started issuing her regular checks from their business account every 2 weeks. Law enforcement decided to launch an undercover operation designed to clarify who are the members of this conspiracy and how information was traveling within the conspiracy. And at this point, in April of 2016, Charlie Adelson and Magbanua are no longer dating. They've been broken up for over a year. Catherine Magbanua at this point is actually back together with Garcia. We heard they're on again, off again, and have these kids together. Charlie Adelson has moved on he's had many other girlfriends at that point since Magbanua. And Charlie Adelson and Magbanua, though, they are still friends. They remain close friends since their breakup, and they're still in regular communication by April of 2016, even though they're not together anymore. Rivera, the second hitman in that Prius, was in prison by this point, doing time on an unrelated charge. And the defendant is happily taking care of her grandkids all day, every day. So all the members of this conspiracy have presumably gone on with their lives, believing they've gotten away with murder. So police needed to stage an event that would generate some conversation, some activity between the members of the conspiracy so they could see who the members of the conspiracy were. Their plan was to send an undercover agent posing as someone on behalf of Luis Rivera. He was the hitman who was incarcerated by April of 2016, to walk up to the defendant, Donna Adelson, on the street and try to blackmail her for money. Law enforcement refers to this as a bump. This undercover agent is posing as a blackmailer. He hands the defendant a piece of paper, and on the piece of paper is a news article about Dan Markel's murder. And written on the piece of paper is a phone number and the amount of $5,000. He tells the defendant that he knows the Adelsons are taking care of Katie, and he's basically there to blackmail to get more money out of them on Rivera's behalf, to even things out, because he knows they're taking care of Katie. The defendant then puts the piece of paper in her purse and walks away without ever looking at the piece of paper, because she knew exactly what it was about. The first person that this defendant calls is Charlie Adelson. She tells Charlie Adelson that she needs to talk to him in person. She said that it involves the two of us, and that he should know what she's talking about. The defendant and Charlie Adelson continue talking, and she says that he should bring cash to their meeting. And she says the TV is probably about 5. She only says that the blackmailer mentioned an ex-girlfriend. Charlie Adelson never asks his mom, "My ex-girlfriend? Which ex-girlfriend?" He's had a lot. He never asked that she was being blackmailed about Danny's murder, where the TV was the alibi, and he knew that the ex-girlfriend in question was the only ex-girlfriend that he had solicited to find a hitman for him, Catherine Magbanua. After this call with his mother, the defendant, Charlie Adelson, calls Catherine McBanois. He does not call his most recent ex-girlfriend or even the one before that. He calls Catherine McBanois. After Charlie Adelson's first call to Catherine McBanois, Charlie Adelson then meets up in person with his mother, the defendant. And in person, she gives him the paperwork that this blackmailer gave to her and makes it Charlie Adelson's newest problem to solve. Charlie Adelson and Catherine McBanois meet in person at a restaurant called Dolce Vita in Miami. And while they sit at their table in this busy, noisy restaurant, an undercover FBI agent is sitting at a table nearby with a camera hidden in a bag. And in the recording, we hear Charlie Adelson discussing whether the man who walked up to his mother could be an undercover police officer, or he could be someone trying to legitimately blackmail them. And if it's a blackmailer, is it somebody who just saw a way to make a quick buck? Or is it another situation entirely, which would be much worse for the Adelsons? And in fact, Charlie Adelson tells her, hey, if they had any evidence, we would have already gone to the airport. Charlie Adelson also says that crimes are tough to prove unless someone actually witnessed the suspect commit the crime, or the suspect confesses to the crime, or a suspect is caught on a wire talking about the crime. And he begins educating Catherine McBanois about how blackmail works. He tells her that, hey, if this is a guy who knows information, there's two ways of dealing with this guy. You know, we could call the police, but then the guy blackmailing us could be charged, and then that blackmailer is going to start talking, and the police are going to be asking questions about what happened. The other option is to pay the blackmailer, but let him know that this is just a one-time thing, and we'll try to scare him off by saying, if you come around again, we'll go to the police. And Charlie Adelson said he would give McBanois the $5,000 to pay off the blackmailer who approached his mother, except that he's concerned that this guy won't go away. He'll get that $5,000 and then he'll just keep coming back for more money. We'll see him as an easy target. And so Charlie Adelson then offers that the best solution might be to have the blackmailer killed, and that he's willing to pay whatever it takes. He says, so help me God, if they F with my family, it's going to be Nazi shit, because this will be done. I mean, Katie, I don't care what I spend. After Charlie Adelson finishes this meeting where he's getting McBanois to then solve the problem of the blackmailer, he gives her they say goodbye. He gives her a big hug that's captured on camera outside by the FBI. And then Charlie Adelson immediately calls the defendant to let her know everything's fine and he has handled the situation. He does this using some pretty obvious code words that you'll often hear these conspirators use to mask the meaning of what they're talking about in case law enforcement's listening. McBanois then, also using code words, calls Garcia, and she tasks him with calling the number on the paperwork and finding the identity of the blackmailer. After that undercover operation was over in 2016, Luis Rivera and Sigfredo Garcia are arrested, and they're charged with the same charges before y'all on this trial. Luis Rivera, who was the second person in that Prius, cut a deal with the state and told law enforcement the truth about the murder of Dan Markel and the people responsible for it. Rivera said that during the trip to Tallahassee, Garcia had a piece of paper with a picture of the man that they were hired to kill and some handwritten notes. And during that trip, Rivera said that the first call that either of them made after the homicide was from Garcia to McBanois, where Garcia told her that the job was done and McBanois assured them they would get their money the next day. which they did, that Magbanua brought the money the next morning to Rivera's home. And after learning this from Rivera, Magbanua was arrested, and that was in October of 2016. During this trial, you'll hear that the Adelson family had access to a lot of cash because their family gave cash discounts at their dental practice. Like if you paid in cash, you would have to pay less than if you paid on a card or check. And they kept the cash that they received in stacks, and they stored it in a safe. 3 years after Garcia's arrest, in 2019, he was convicted at his trial. Law enforcement continued, though, to gather evidence. They continued to interview people who may possibly have information and to clarify all of these recordings the FBI did that couldn't be clearly heard. And thanks to their tireless efforts, in March of 2022, Charlie Adelson was indicted. 2 months later, in May of 2022, Catherine Magbanua's case went to trial, and she was convicted. Magbanua testified in Charlie Adelson's trial in October of 2023 and said that Charlie Adelson wanted to hire someone to kill his sister's ex because his mom was stressed out over all of the problems his sister was having with her ex-husband. Magbanua agreed to help him and ended up recruiting her children's father, Garcia, and also Rivera to kill Dan Markel. She says that the night of the murder, she went to Charlie Adelson's house to pick up the payment for the murder. And when she arrived, Charlie Adelson said that his parents had just been at the house and that Charlie Adelson had the money for her there. Magbanua then spent the night with Charlie Adelson that night, and the next morning, on July 19th, he put the money that she was to divide up into the trunk of her car. In Charlie Adelson's trial, Charlie Adelson took the stand, and he testified that Magbanua, Garcia, and Rivera were all in on this crime together, but that the Adelsons had nothing to do with it. They were the innocent ones. He crafted an elaborate story in which Garcia and Rivera came to Tallahassee on their own, killed Dan Markel without his knowledge or his family's knowledge, and then these killers colluded with Magbanua to play he and his mother for fools and extort money out of them. And for many reasons, which will be revealed to y'all in this trial, Charlie's interpretation of the facts was not reasonable to believe, and he was convicted. Charlie Adelson was convicted in November of 2023, and within hours of his guilty verdict, this defendant began to plan to flee the United States to a country that she could not be extradited from in order to avoid being arrested for Dan Markel's murder. The defendant on her phone researched countries that did not have extradition treaties with the United States, and she applied for an emergency visa to Vietnam. She was overheard planning to put her money in trusts for her grandchildren, and she and her husband purchased one-way tickets with a fast-track emergency visa to Vietnam. And Vietnam does not have an extradition treaty with the U.S., as she would have learned from her searches. And just days later, she was stopped by law enforcement on the jetway in Miami International Airport, where she was boarding her one-way flight to Vietnam, and she was then charged for her participation in the murder of Dan Markel. Law enforcement received information from women who said that the defendant, Donna Adelson, was offering them bribes in exchange for false testimony in this trial. They said Donna Adelson promised them money, housing, veneers, prescription drugs, if they were willing to testify that Catherine Magbanua told them a completely different story about the crime than the one that she would be testifying to. One informant was even able to show law enforcement a script, a question and answer session for a direct examination in trial that Donna Adelson herself wrote. and that Donna Adelson wanted this informant to memorize and come into court and perjure herself by reciting it to you here in trial. Please listen to all of the evidence that y'all are going to see and hear in this trial. I know it's been a long week already, and we have a lot of evidence for you in this case, but when you do, you will see that this defendant conspired with her son, Charlie Adelson, who solicited his girlfriend, Catherine Ray Benoit, to get this murder done. And then this defendant paid her with cash, with checks for the job once it was completed. The defendant acted in furtherance of this murder plot that went beyond just thinking about it or just talking about it. And these acts make her guilty as a principal to first-degree murder, just as if she was the one pulling the trigger in the garage herself. And while the defendant's choices helped solve a problem within her family, they came at a very high price. She took the life of a loving father of 2 little boys and caused a lifetime of grief for Dan Markel's loved ones. And at the conclusion of the evidence in this case, you will be convinced beyond any reasonable doubt that this defendant is guilty. And at that point, we'll ask you for the only verdict that does justice in this case, which is a verdict that this defendant is guilty as charged. Thank you.